Can you see the slide? Okay, great. So first of all, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to participate in this great conference. Thank you very much. And my name is Almut. I work for the Dutch Montagu's Harrier Foundation, and I would like to present you some results of our work on the protection of the Montagu's Harrier in the Netherlands. To start with, also in the Netherlands, the population of the Montagu's Harrier is rather small. So we have on average 50 breeding pairs, and the species is categorized as critically endangered on the Dutch Red List. The distribution of the breeding pairs in the country is mostly in the north of the country, and especially in the eastern part of the province of Groningen, which is this province. But there are also quite some couples found in the northern part of Groningen and in Friesland. And every year there are some breeding pairs in Flevoland, and the other provinces are just single pairs in some years. As you can see here, the agricultural landscape in the Netherlands is very intensive. So if we are talking about rural vegetation, Zima, I remember very well the ruined farms in eastern Belarus. It's impossible to think about something like this here. So we have large scale agriculture with very few natural structures and big fields. The population development in the Netherlands is quite interesting. So there were already in the 80s around 50 breeding pairs, but they were mostly breeding in Flevoland because this was created just recently before that. So there was a succession of vegetation where the birds bred in. But then at the end of the 80s, the species got nearly extinct. So there were only several pairs left. And then they were really lucky because in Eastern Groningen, there was an overproduction of winter wheat. So the government had a regulation that 20% of the area were set aside. And then the Montagu's Harriers turned up in this area and started to increase a lot. So they came to this area because there was the set aside and a lot of voles, of course. And at the same time, nest protection was started by fencing the nests. So you see it increased, but you also see that after these set aside regulations were stopped, it decreased immediately again. But luckily, due to the implementation of agri-environmental schemes from 1997 onwards, the population increased and is now around 50 pairs. And as you can see on top, this year was the best year ever with 80 breeding pairs. These agri-environmental schemes are field margins or bigger fields implemented for the Montagu's Harriers, and they should provide food. I will come back to that later. And you see that they are one of the few structures that are not blown during the winter. So they remain green for some years, which is very important. If we look at the number of breeding pairs just from the years 2010 to 2020, we see that it's varying around 50. And on this orange line, we see that the number of chicks fledged is varying quite a bit more. So there were some very good years, like here in 2014-15, where more than 100 chicks fledged. And then there are very bad years where less than 80 birds fledge. But then last year we had the topmost year ever with 142 chicks fledged. And this year we had 80 breeding pairs, but we only had 100 chicks fledged. So this is not always correlated. So we had many breeding pairs that started and were failing early in the season, and also birds that didn't even really start. So this is quite interesting. The mean breeding success per pair in this period was around 1.6. And you can see back these years where there were many chicks fledged, where the breeding success is above 2, which is really good. And in most of the other years, it's below 1.5. So it differs quite a lot. We already heard a lot about breeding habitats in the different countries. Here we can see from the 70s, 80s and 90s and then 2000s onwards, where the Montagu's Harriers in the Netherlands bred in. And as I already mentioned with the population development slide, we had these succession stages with natural vegetation and tree plantations where the birds bred in the 70s and 80s. But when they turned up in Groningen, in the agricultural fields, they started to breed in winter wheat and alfalfa. Alfalfa was very much in the beginning. Now we have some years where it's popular, but most of the years it's winter wheat where most of the breeding pairs are located in. And this is only going to 2013, but it's the same picture for the rest of the years until now. Here we see a female on the nest in alfalfa. And the difficult part with this crop is that it's already harvested at the beginning of May for the first time. So the birds are still on eggs. And that's why we put electric fences around these nests, covering 10 by 10 meters to protect them after the harvest from predation. In winter wheat, where most of the pairs breed, we use a different technique, more similar to what we've seen already this morning. We use wire fences, which we put around the nest with a diameter of approximately 2 meters. And here we can see how it's implemented in the field. The edges are bowed to the outside, so predators could not easily spring over the fence. And this works quite well. And during the harvest, the farmer drives around this fence and leaves only a small plot. And because we had the discussion before, I would like to mention that our farmers are also not paid for this, so they voluntarily participate, but they are also they also should do so because it's a red listed species. So normally all of them really like it, and there are only few where we have to discuss to protect the nests. Except for the nest protection, which is one very important part, as we have heard already, because without that, chicks don't fledge before harvest. It's to know about what the birds eat during the summer. So we have collected a lot of pellets during the breeding seasons from the 90s onwards, and it's very obvious, you already see the color of the pellets, that there are a lot of voles in it. And on average, that the common vole is 60% of the diet of the Montagu's Harrier, and about 20% is consists of passerines. But in good vole years, this can be up to more than 90%. So then they nearly only eat voles. This is very good to know, because which kind of measures could you implement to help them have more food available in their breeding area? That's set aside, because in set aside there are more voles than in other crops. And this we can show in this graph. We have counted vole holes along 100-meter transects. Excuse me. And you can see that in set-aside and field margins, the number of vole holes is much, much larger than in intensive grasslands or winter wheat. So set-aside really provides a lot of food. Another interesting point is that on fields with field margins implemented, the fields themselves have higher vole densities too. So here we see for grass fields with no field margin adjacent, and field margins adjacent, and the same for winter wheat without and with a field margin. And we see again the number of vole holes per 100 meters, and you can see that it's much, much higher in a grass field and in a winter field where a field margin is going along the field. But of course, we would like to know how these harriers use the agri-environmental schemes, because as you all know, the implementation is very expensive. And we have seen that they react to it. So the population was increasing since the implementation of the first ones. But we really wanted to understand how they are using it and to what extent. To study this, we started to put GPS trackers on birds, especially males, because they do the foraging during the breeding season in 2009. And with these GPS trackers, we get a lot of data of the individual birds, and we can see the daily, seasonal, and annual movements and space use and the home range of these birds. And if we look at what we get for 20 home ranges of 14 males and a lot of GPS positions, you see that it's quite impressive how different these home ranges look. So here every home range has a different color, and we see that the form and the size varies a lot. So if we had only tracked like this harrier, we would say a different thing about the home range size of these birds than if we only had to track these the pink one. So it's very important to keep in mind that this can be different between years, between individuals, and so on, so that we need a big enough sample size to conclude important things. So if you look at a single one, which has its nest here, the red spot, you see that it's using a core area very much, and it makes some trips to the outside areas. And here we have a home range method where we just count the number of cells. So we put little cells, and we see the cells he uses most are the blue ones, and the light red ones are the ones where he has only been once. If we do that for all the birds, we see that there is a big variation in individual home ranges. So there are some birds having big ones and small ones, and actually it's a 5-fold variation between individuals, which is quite large. And these home ranges are covering from 200, the smallest one, which is approximately 2.5 square kilometers, to 1,400 squares of these cells, which is 87.5 square kilometers. So there's quite a large variation between individuals. What we also can do is to see which habitats the birds use per day. Because we get positions every 5 minutes, we can really look into daily habitat use. And here we see for each bar is a day during the chick rearing period of one single male. And we can see that the crops, the normal cereals and potatoes, he's flying over a lot, but he also uses a lot of grass, and in red, the set-aside measures, which are agri-environmental schemes. So this looks quite nice. He makes use of them. Another individual, however, shows much less red. So we see a single day he uses an agri-environmental scheme quite a lot, but all the other days, he doesn't make a lot of use. So this is quite disappointing, actually. Instead, he uses a lot of grass. A third one looks very different. And here, I hope you can see it well on the screen. We have to be careful that this is a different red. Raymond called this set-aside alike. So these are not agri-environmental schemes implemented for farmland birds, but this is set aside like fallow land from industry or a building project where no houses are built yet. So this is not agri-environmental schemes. And this individual is using those to a large amount of time. So he's nearly foraging all the time on these fallow lands, which is quite interesting. So if we look at the individual habitat use, so now every bar is a single individual and not a day, we see that there are 3 groups of birds. Some that use the agri-environmental schemes for quite some extent, about 12%, which is not that much. And others, they nearly don't use it at all. And then we have these individuals breeding close to another kind of set-aside, which they use a lot, which is really interesting. And by the way, these are the ones with the smallest home ranges. They just go back and forth to these places. So actually what we get as a result is quite paradoxical. Most important prey are voles, we have seen from the diet analysis. The highest vole densities are found in the set-aside, not in the grassland. But with the GPS tracking, we saw that set-aside is used less than expected, and they prefer intensive grassland because it's easier to catch the voles, which you can see on the picture here. The vegetation is shorter and it's mown quite regularly. And we also saw that some individuals exploit these non-AES set-aside fields. So the thing which is clear from this is that it's not only about the abundance of prey, but it's all about availability. You can have a lot of high set-aside vegetation with a lot of voles, but the birds just can't get them. So this led us to invent a new targeted agri-environmental scheme called Birdfields, especially designed for the Montagu's Harrier. This is a AES on a field approach, so it's not a strip, but it's a whole field implemented for the birds, where strips of set-aside with high vole densities and strips of alfalfa that enhance the availability of moles during mowing. So you see that the whole field is covered by strips and the alfalfa is mown like normal alfalfa. In these periods, the voles are available to the birds. Like this, we create high quality foraging habitat for the Harriers. But do they use that? Here we see an example of a GPS-tracked bird breeding at the red spot. The day before the mowing, he comes along the bird fields, which are here. The day of the mowing, he comes there quite often already. And the day after, when also the alfalfa is removed, the cut ones, he comes there like all day. So he's spending all his hunting time on these fields, and he's flying back and forth to his nest, spending there a lot of time. And that was not only true for one single male, but for all 4 breeding adjacent to these bird fields in this example. And you see the dashed lines are the dates of mowing, and the second round here. And you can see that especially after mowing, the birds spend an immense amount of their hunting time on these fields, like nearly all that time. Also during the periods in between they went there, but especially after the mowing, they came to these fields. And if you look on that in a map version, you see that very clearly. They come here and they search for the voles in the mown strips, which are the dark ones. And these are just 3 days after the mowing. So you see that they spend a lot of time flying along these structures and crossing the unmown strips to go to the next one. So we see they use them, even though in the set-aside are more voles than in the alfalfa, they prefer the availability of the mown strips. And of course, not only Montagu's Harriers profit from these measures, but also hen Harriers and marsh Harriers that are breeding in the same area profit from these measurement schemes. But this sounds like a great success, which it is because the Harrier population increased, but still the Harriers have to work very hard in this intensified agricultural landscape. You can see here during the breeding period, the proportion of time they spend flying, the males having successful nests. And you see that especially towards the end of the breeding season, they spend quite a lot of time of the day flying. And in these long summer days, this is about 10 to 12 hours a day. So if you look at the box plots, you see that especially the chick rearing period is really, really intense for them. They have to fly a lot during the day. And this might have effects, of course, on the birds. So we have to keep in mind that we can help them in such an intensive agricultural landscape, but maybe they still have to work too hard. And to go more into this direction, I just want to give a single example, which we found during a study. So we compared birds from Denmark, the Netherlands, the population I just explained everything about, and France. And actually, I just wanted to calculate how many kilometers the birds fly per day in the whole year, so then the whole annual cycle. So we checked all these birds and we calculated the distances they travel. And then a very interesting pattern turned up. So we see in green the distance the males fly during the breeding season, and then the females in Denmark, the males in the Netherlands, the females in the Netherlands, and the males in France and the females in France. And it's quite interesting that the males in France, they fly much less during the breeding season than the Dutch and the Danish males. So the Danish and the Dutch males fly about 200 kilometers per day during the breeding season, every day. And the French one's about 100, which is half of the distance. And this is quite interesting and makes me wonder what that has to do with the landscape. So there must be an impact of the landscape. And I was lucky enough to live in France for some years, and the landscape is much more varied, even if the French people, of course, say it changed a lot during the last years, which is true. But compared to the Netherlands, it's still much more varied. And I would very much like to go more into this comparison and deepen it and compare it to other populations, going to the direction what Dominique already said in the beginning, that we could get very interesting information from comparing breeding populations. And I think that's what's the next step. And we have to keep in mind that it's very important to preserve existing good habitats and try to improve the ones which are not good enough anymore. And of course, go on with nest protection. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to all our volunteers, colleagues, and collaborators in whole of Europe.